Now I'm going to add a road spline into the scene. So to do that, the first thing you're going to want to do is go to your modes panel, then choose landscape, and then manage. So instead of sculpt, we're going to choose manage. And then we're going to go down to the tools, and we're going to make sure that we select edit splines. Now I'm going to just zoom out a little bit on my landscape. And if you notice, I can actually click and hold down Control at the same time, and then click. And you'll see that this little gizmo has formed. This is called a control point. And if I hold down Control and click again on the landscape, you can see that I've just made a second control point. And the two have actually become connected together. And that's called a segment. So you've got control points and segments. If we select the end of a control point, we can add a new segment to the terrain. And I'm just going to keep clicking to add new segments, and each will become an addition to our road. You can see I already laid out a sort of path here with a brush for where I want that road to be. And we'll just lead it all the way into the distance. I'm just going to jump back to my Vista point. I've got a little hotkey that's set up here, so I can jump back to the Vista point at any time. And as you can see, I've got a nice sort of layout here for where I want my road to be. Now you can also choose one of the control points, and you can actually move that control point in space with the translate tool. And you can also switch to rotation, so you can rotate it. So you can rotate and translate just like any other object and make sure it sort of aligns to the terrain. And don't worry too much at this point whether it's intersecting with the terrain or, you know, if you've got some sort of overlaps like this, because you'll see later how those will get corrected. Just going to shape our road a little bit differently here. And the most important thing is just to kind of get the road to show up through the terrain, get it looking like a nice green line at this point. Okay, that looks pretty nice. And that's how the shot looks overall now. So the next step is going to be actually adding a mesh to our road and a texture. So to do that, we're going to come to the details panel, and we're going to click on select all connected segments. You can also select all connected control points, but in this case, we want to choose segments. We're going to come down right to the bottom here where it says landscape spline meshes. And we're going to add a new spline mesh. I'm going to maximize that 0. And then I'm going to open up the content browser. And inside of Brushify, Meshes, Roads, you'll see a Meshes folder. Inside that Meshes folder will be s_road plane. Just drag and drop that onto the mesh slot. So now you can see that that's actually given us a mesh that conforms to the spline. If I move the control points around, that mesh is going to move with our spline. So yeah, that looks pretty good. But as you can see, it's a completely gray texture at the moment. So what we're going to want to do is add a material onto this mesh. And to do that, I want to go back to the details panel, and I want to select all the segments again. So make sure all the segments are selected. And I want to scroll down here to where it says spline meshes, and I want to choose material overrides, and I want to add an element. So we want to open up the content browser. So let's do that. And we want to go to Brushify, Meshes, Roads, and then Materials. And inside that Materials folder, we've got different options. We've got dirt, mud, and pebbles. I think for my scene, I want to go with a more pebbles texture. So I'm going to go in there. And then I'm simply going to drag and drop one of the material instances onto my material override slot. Let's zoom in a little bit. And as you can see, we've already got a nice texture going here on the road. If I hit play, we could start to run around. But one thing you might notice is that the scale of this texture is way too big, so it doesn't really look correct. To fix that, we can go to our control points, And instead of a width of 1,000, we're going to change the width to something more like 150. Maybe 250. Let's be a bit more generous with that. And zoom in. And now you can see that the road is slightly more accurately scaled and has a bit more of a reasonable size. Let's go back to the segments again, and let's see if we can try some other textures here on the road. That one's quite nice. Got the one here with some sort of rocks on the sides. Okay, cool. So once you have your road in that sort of situation, you can then start to play around and experiment with the width, with the sort of scale of it, and try and find something that's more suitable. I think a little bit wider is going to suit me a bit better here. One really easy way to make the landscape actually conform to this road now is if I select all the segments and then I click Deform Landscapes to Splines and click Only Selected. And if we Control Z and then click that again, you can see the difference. It actually creates, it actually makes the terrain conform to our road. It's very useful. And you might also notice that if we raise our road up, so if I select all the control points here, if we raise our road up and we perhaps decrease our side fall off a little bit, this side fall off actually determines how the road becomes deformed. So if I choose segments again and click only selected, you can see that there's a sort of fall off that's formed up until that distance. Of course, if I select the whole control, all the control points again, move the road even sort of further up, and then increase that side fall off to say something crazy, 1500. Let's maybe go down even. That might be even more interesting. Make a sort of valley out of our road. And then now we hit segments and then only selected. You can see that now everything started to fall downward in a sort of valley shape. This technique is really cool because it lets you quickly place roads on the landscape, and with only a few adjustments, you'll be able to get some really nice results. As you can see as well, they nicely blend on the edges, so you don't really have to worry about that. Just going to adjust a few more things, and then I think this spline is pretty much good to go. Just make sure you go Edit Splines, and just double check all of the parts of the road to make sure that nothing's floating. If things do float, or if the actual road does clip through the terrain, the good thing is that the shader actually has a little bit of a feathering effect on the edges where the mesh actually clips, so it won't be super harsh. And you can actually tweak that effect if you go to the segments and you bring up your material. Just double click that. And inside of the material, you'll have a bunch of settings here for the textures and all that sort of stuff. But if you come down to where it says edge blending, you can actually tweak the way that this edge blends. So if I just change the distance here, you can start to see that I'm affecting how it blends. And there's also a fade start distance. Usually you can leave these to their defaults, but yeah, it can make some really, if I completely turn it off, you can see just how hard the edge looks. That would be the normal setting. And if I switch it to the default, you can now see that there's actually a really nice line. If you go too far with it, it will start to affect the shadows though, so be careful with cranking it up right to the top. Another really cool feature is the parallax occlusion mapping, which you can also alter in the material instance for the road. So you can just come down here to parallax occlusion mapping, and you can change the height ratio. So you can see how that affects the terrain. If you set it to 0, you'll have no parallax occlusion mapping at all. And if you bump that up, let's say 0.1, you can see how it starts to create an effect. The default is something like 0.08, but for this it's turned down a little bit to 0.035. You can also alter the plane on which the parallax forms, but usually that's already set for you in the material. So if in doubt, leave the materials at their default settings. But if you do want to increase the quality or tweak the settings, you can do it here. You can also, of course, tweak the quality by increasing the max number of steps for the parallax and the minimum number of steps as well. But mostly that's just going to cost you a bit more performance and give you a sort of negligible increase in the visual fidelity. So usually just keep those to the defaults. So yeah, that's parallax mapping and edge blending. There are also some other functions on here for the distance tiling. This road system has actually got a sort of its own sort of detail tiling system, so that you don't get this horrible looking tiling on distance in roads. Tiling of the same rocks over and over again in a sort of repeating pattern. So it has got a sort of built-in global distance and macro distance setting. So if we crank that up, you can see that if I make it so that the detail texture repeats all the time, you can start to see the repetition here going off into the distance. But at the default setting, you can see that sort of fades away into a more macro texture, which is usually set to something like 2000 distance. But if you do want, you can crank that distance up a little bit. It all depends on whether you have a map that shows a lot of tiling or not. So yeah, that's a quick overview of the road shader and how the road tool works. So hopefully you now have an overview of how to add a road spline to the landscape. I sped up this section to show how I added the landscape splines and how I sort of adjust things to make sure that the road sort of fits in with the terrain. I always jump back to my vista spot to check that the composition overall looks quite good and that I've got this kind of winding road making a sort of S shape through the valley. I then add the road mesh and the material, and I start tweaking all of the little detailed settings like the road's width and adjusting the terrain with a bit of the fall off. Again, don't be afraid to make big changes. In this case, I wanted to increase that sort of feeling that this is a valley by creating a big fall off on the side of the road and then embedding the road down deeper into the terrain, and then actually deforming the landscape to the road. I then had to go over with the sculpting brushes again and add a few little details to the left and the right of the road. Don't worry too much about making everything perfect at this stage. We're really just sort of blocking out an overall landscape for our scene. And of course, we can always go in later and add more details and refine certain things. So we've now got a basic landscape and a road.